Third big trend is on governance. And Linda touched on this shift towards democracy. And my figure 5 has the number of Sub-Saharan African democracies, which went way up in the 1990s, rose again in the early 2000s, and has stagnated and by some measures fallen back in the last couple of years. And it's important to think about the countries where that's falling back, but the dominant trend has been that the countries that shifted to democracy in the 1990s and early 2000s have stayed with it. It's the exceptions that are thinking about going backwards, but the big trend has been this big shift to democracy. It's fragile, it's imperfect, the elections don't always work very well, they're too cozy with business, just like here in many ways. We have a tendency, and I get quite frustrated actually, with with Westerners and folks from the United States, you know, preaching about how we expect democracy to be perfect in Africa now, even though our own experience quite clearly is that this is really hard. And after more than 200 years in our own democracy, it's far from perfect. I think we cannot expect that in 2 decades, countries go from centuries of colonial rule and other kinds of misrule, 2 decades of dictatorship across the country to perfect democracy. That does not mean that we stand by and accept whatever the dictators do or the imperfect leaders do. It means that we have to mix the pressure for change and the ambition for change along with recognizing that democracy is hard, really hard, and it's going to take generations for it to continue to strengthen and move forward. But along with the shift to democracy, there's an improvement in governance. It's not just elections. This is much deeper than that. And Chart 6 shows some global governance rankings, and you'll see that the electoral democracies, what Freedom House refers to as the electoral democracies in Sub-Saharan Africa, their global governance ranking is in the 43rd percentile, just below the median for the world, not developing countries, but for the world, and is actually higher or on par with China, India, most of South America, and Southern Asia. So you get fairly impressive improvements in governance in the countries that are democracies. In those that are not, the non-democracies, the oil exporters in particular, pretty poor governance. So again, this divergence of experience across the continent. And it's not perfect with the democracies. There are several countries, Ethiopia, Uganda, Rwanda, that are not democracies, that have improved in terms of governance, but again, those are the exceptions. Most of the countries that have improved in governance are also the countries that are democracies. So we have the shift in democracy, this improvement in governance in about half the countries, and with that, a reduction in conflict. And my last figure is the total number of battle deaths. There's a corresponding figure that I don't have here in the number of civil wars. And while there is a lot of conflict and a lot of war on the continent, there is much less now than there has been in the past, and certainly far less than there was in the 1970s and 80s. And this figure just shows how deaths in battle as one indicator of violence have fallen. The number of coups have fallen, the number of assassinations have fallen, and it's a much, frankly, more peaceful place today, despite the ongoing conflicts that we all know about. So those are all aspects of part of governance. Now, so those first 3 changes, this diversity, the divergence, the surge in growth, the improvement in health, education, and governance, these are fairly fundamental changes. And I want to stress that because I'm going to talk a minute about the change in oil and commodity prices, but there have been major fundamental shifts in about half the countries in Africa towards better governance, towards the beginnings of democracy, towards improvements in civil liberties and political rights and freedoms of the press and freedoms of speech. Far from perfect, but fundamental changes. Big investments in education and in girls' education, improvements in health. These are the fundamental factors that matter far more than what commodity prices are doing in terms of driving long-term progress. And we need to keep our eye on that and think about how to sustain that and build that going forward.